Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's weekly webinar from Real Story Group. My name is Scott Dill, and I'm on the business development team here with RSG. Our founder and CEO, Tony Byrne, as you can see, is on the line with us as well. And we're going to talk about a topic that's near and dear to our hearts today, about where should CDPs stop and journey orchestration engines begin. It's a topic that's coming up in a number of conversations with our customers on a seemingly daily basis. So Tony's going to walk us through the heart of today's presentation as we go and try to answer that question as best we can. As we get started, we do have a number of folks on the line today, and if you're new to these webinars, we do have time for questions at the end, so you can enter those into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. Also, you will receive this deck within the next couple of days, so keep an eye out from an email from our marketing team. You'll get the slides from today's presentation. And to our customers on the line, you will, as always, be able to access a recording of this presentation in your customer library. So stay tuned for that and keep an eye out for that over the next couple of days. As we get started, I just want to give a quick overview of the markets we cover within Real Story Group and our research. Today, as you see, we'll focus on the orange and the purple lines there, customer data platforms and journey orchestration engines. But really, we focus on the entire MarTech, or as we like to call it, the Omnichannel technology stack. So we started 20 years ago focusing on web content management. Since then, we've added areas like DAM and marketing automation and Omnichannel content platforms. And so our customers will either subscribe to one of these research areas, or for a number of folks, subscribe to all of our research areas, where we're taking a more holistic look at their stack and advising them through that process. So as always, you're welcome to download excerpts from our research after today's presentation. Certainly we want you to focus on what Tony has to say today. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tony to talk about CDPs and journey orchestration engines. Tony?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Really interesting topic. What's the boundary? What's the overlap? What are the trends? I think what's particularly interesting about this is that I had been given this webinar maybe 18 months ago. The stories I might be telling you and the analysis we might be making might have been rather different. And so that ought to give us all pause here, that there's a lot of change transpiring in these marketplaces, and certainly among customer demand from people like you who are trying to implement these platforms. And so we should all take all of the advice that we get, maybe a little bit of a grain of salt. But also, I think what I'm going to do here, rather than being really, detailed, prescriptive in a really detailed way, is to just talk about what are some themes, and then certainly wrap up with 6 key pieces of advice. But again, with that caveat that things are definitely changing. Nobody knows exactly what the future looks like. But we think that there's some key near-term trends for you to keep an eye on, and then some long-term trends for you to pay attention to. So as always, we like to give the business context for this, which is that, we're all trying to engage with customers and prospects. By necessity, we do that through different channels where we're interacting with them, where we want to contextualize and assemble the right experiences. And so part of this, as you know, is really getting the right content and message to the right person in the right context at the right time, and then of course measure and over time optimize that effectiveness. And so this, of course, is the challenge of MarTech and CX, is how to put these pieces together in a meaningful way, particularly in a world where you have these constantly expanding stacks and where you have these constantly sort of broadening set of customer engagement channels. And I think we can all sort of relate to this, which is that almost all of us live and are trying to address serious silo problems. And particularly when you turn this around, you start looking at this from the customer's perspective or the prospect's perspective, looking into your enterprise as opposed to you looking out, then this disjointed, disconnected, inconsistent experience, I think, becomes even more into relief. And the major challenge here, there's a lot of issues underneath this, but the major challenge here is that from a silo perspective, we've jammed too much into individual silos, where in many cases the technologies underneath this have their own content, their own data, their own decisioning, their own planning mechanisms, and their own analytics subsystems. And so it's becoming impossible to then orchestrate across this, let alone apply some consistency across a model, that a service model that looks like this. Yet for most of you today, your world does look like this. So our answer to this is a new kind of enterprise target reference model for an integrated customer experience. None of the large enterprises that we work with are here yet, but nearly all of them are trying to get here. And the idea is that you still are always going to have these different engagement channels where you are still going to want to have context-specific experiences for prospects and customers. But if you're going to do this in an integrated, holistic, customer-centric way, you have to break out some foundation services and decouple those from individual engagement channels. So certainly omnichannel operations for cross-team collaboration and planning. Certainly unified customer data, which we'll talk a lot today, really with the angle that this is table stakes for doing this. Journey orchestration, the other topic today, for omnichannel personalization and next best action and other sorts of decisioning. Omnichannel content, really more of an emergent need in an emergent marketplace. And then probably the most mature space would be around core customer data intelligence, so analytics, reporting, modeling, and some really foundational data processing and integration that needs to happen at an enterprise level for that. So these are various capabilities that you need at an enterprise-wide level that are then decoupled or disconnected from individual engagement channels to allow you to provide this more of a holistic view and holistic response to your customers across the whole digital landscape. And so this is kind of a target service model. From an architecture model, what this means is, again, you have these engagement channels. Underneath that, various interaction delivery environments like applications, e-commerce, contact centers, and so forth. And then content and engagement management platforms. And most of you have been spending the last decade, in some cases decade and a half, trying to modernize and optimize these environments, whether it's CRM, social, email, and marketing automation, WCM, and so forth. Our argument is that the target model in the 2020s kind of elongates or deepens your architecture and says, look, there's a set of enterprise foundation platforms that are likely to reside underneath this, including journey orchestration engines, customer data platforms, omnichannel content, operations hubs, intelligence hubs for data management. And then, of course, underneath all of it is customer identity and access management and related issues around SSO. So this is, again, a target reference model, which we use really as a point of departure for having kind of deeper discussions around these concepts and around future roadmaps with our subscribers. So so with that kind of framework, let's take a deeper look at the two technologies we're talking about today. First, customer data platforms and how they're evolving. They're evolving in a number of different ways. And you can find other webinars on our site, both past and future, around this very issue. But I want to talk about it in connection in particular with personalization and decisioning. So the first thing is to kind of level set, again, with a kind of service model around what CDPs do. And they take first-party data, potentially second and third-party, or for that matter, zero-party data. And you end up with some enterprise data management, which may or may not be done in some sort of an enterprise data fabric, and then customer data activation. So you've got a whole series of core data management services on the left: ingest, processing, unification, enrichment, graphing, rules, cleaning, all sorts of other things. And then customer data activation on the right, including customer API, segmentation, activation, potentially event handling and personalization, and other services, then pushing off to the far right into various engagement channels. I think a lot of you already kind of understand this conceptually around what CDPs do. What's interesting about this from our standpoint is the potential scope of the CDP could be both of these middle columns, or maybe just one of them. For example, many of you already have an enterprise data fabric that's already handling a lot of the core data management and unification capabilities. And so from a CDP perspective, you just need customer data activation. Some CDPs focus on both of these, some just on the right. And so that's already a key architectural question that gets addressed in our research and certainly in our analysis of the vendor landscape. But what's also interesting here is that with respect to customer data activation, the CDP may or may not have event handling and personalization. I think it's really all started with event handling. And it's interesting about this because many CDPs actually don't handle events or don't handle them very robustly. And so that's a choice that you may or may not need this. We're finding increasingly among our subscribers that they do want this in the CDP. And once you start having an event subsystem, then to a certain extent, you're already starting to do some decisioning, right? In other words, if this happens, then do that, which is the sort of decisioning that very often you might see in a journey orchestration engine. So right off the bat, you can see some overlap here. But then secondly, we're seeing more and more customer data platforms also build in personalization and even more broadly, journey orchestration subsystems. These tend to be somewhat new, in many cases crude. Not all vendors are going in this direction. It's not always the best direction and may not be services that you want. But there's definitely some overlap there where, again, these are traditional capabilities that you might have seen with a personalization engine or a journey orchestration engine being done within the CDP itself. So right off the bat, you can see there's some overlap here, some natural overlap that's happening in the marketplace, at least on the data side. We'll talk about the decisioning side in a minute, but on the data side, you're already seeing the line kind of getting blurred a little bit between data on the one hand and decisions. The other way to visualize this is through the canonical kind of use case categories for CDPs. So here's the 10 use cases that Real Story Group that we use when we're evaluating CDP vendors. So we do these hard-hitting evaluations of about 30 CDP vendors. And this is the criteria that we use, among other things, to sort of evaluate what they focus on and what they're good at and what they're not so good at. And the typical CDP vendor is usually good at 2, 3, maybe 4 of these things, kind of so-so at 1 or 2, 3 more, and then typically ignores or is weak at 2 or 3 others. That's not unusual. That's pretty common distribution in any technology marketplace. You can check our research for more details on this. But what's interesting for our purposes today is that at least 4 of these use cases get into more of the, not just activation, but potentially engagement with your customers, depending on how much the CDP does here. So there's different levels of engagement that you might see in a CDP with respect to outbound marketing campaign support, where the CDP may or may not be actually touching the customer. Same thing with personalization. Are they actually setting up another personalization engine, or are they actually executing the personalization itself? So there's a wide range of potential intimacy with the actual customer. Another way of putting this is there's a wide range of potential runtime activity the CDP may or may not do. I'm not suggesting that one is better than the other. What I am suggesting is that there's some overlap here kind of baked into the core purposes of a CDP between what a CDP might do and what a personalization and journey orchestration engine or campaign management system might do. And there's a big debate in the industry, should the CDP actually be, a runtime engagement platform like that? I think 2 years ago, architecturally, we would have said no. In the long run, I think the case is going to be against it. But in the near term, there may be some expediency here. And so we'll get into that a little bit too. But first, let's take a look at the marketplace. Again, a lot of vendors, highly fragmented marketplace. We've just published some research yesterday sort of contrasting these 2 different segments of the CDP marketplace. And on the one hand, you have these MarTech suite or so-called cloud vendors on the left. Then on the right, you have pure play platforms, which ironically are almost all native cloud solutions as well. But this is one way to take a look at the market. Our research suggests that the MarTech suite vendors, although they may be the most mature vendors in the market, from a CDP standpoint, they tend to be the most immature solutions. So there's a kind of an irony there, but it's really important. I'm not really doing this just for ironic purposes. I'm doing this to forewarn and hopefully forearm you that if you're defaulting to one of these big kind of anchor vendors on the left, and you're trying to get value from your CDP over the next couple of years, that might be a strategic mistake. So you can get more details around this in some of our hard-hitting evaluations, but that's our conclusion right now. So that's one thing to consider, is that on the one hand, the suite vendors are saying we can bind the CDP with our other services. On the other hand, they're a little bit overcoupled and the products themselves tend to be immature. But there's another way to look at the market by kind of breaking it up into cones, which is what does the CDP focus on? Many of the vendors focus at the top here primarily on activation, some in the lower right primarily on data analytics, some in the lower left primarily around data management, that core data management that I talked about, almost kind of replacing or being a parallel capability to your broader enterprise data, customer data fabric. Again, not making value judgments here, but just suggesting that there's already a kind of implied distribution or disagreement about the scope of the CDP in the marketplace. This is legit. This is a legitimate disagreement. There's rationales for all three of these cones, and for some blend in the middle, which you see some vendors targeting, and that's okay. The key thing for you is to try to figure out where are we, where is our enterprise, and what are we trying to do, with a CDP. I raise this because typically when you see personalization and journey orchestration capabilities, they tend to be among the vendors that are focused on activation, and less mature among the vendors that are focused primarily on back-end data management, which when you think about it, kind of makes sense. But again, that's just one of the consequences that's germane to our discussion. Or another way of putting this is where you're going to see more overlap with journey orchestration and personalization capabilities, you tend to see that more on the north side of this triangle rather than the south side of this triangle. So that's what's going on in the CDP space. Now let's talk about what's happening in the journey orchestration space, and then we'll kind of end up putting this all together for you. I wanted to just remind you once again that if you have any questions at all, or anything you agree with, anything that you disagree with, or any concerns or any vignettes you want to share about your own experience, feel free to use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll definitely have time to get to that at the end, but you feel free to ask now or whenever. Okay, let's talk about the Journey Orchestration Engine, or JOE marketplace. So what is it that these platforms do? Well, they take data and events in, and I'm going to talk about data in a second because data is very important, in fact, essential to this. Then they may listen and map what's happening, help you plan and model, and then ultimately activate some activity, and then visualize what happened, and then ideally help you analyze and optimize. Now, do this by then pushing data and events out to engagement platforms. This is the kind of theoretical view. A couple things to say about this. Not all journey orchestration engines do all four phases of this. That's intentional. Some focus more on listening and mapping, others a little bit more on analyzing and optimizing. Some tend to do the engagement itself, others are trying to trigger external engagement platforms, so there's a little bit of architectural messiness there. I think that there's also important to point out this kind of underlying theme that the technology here is maybe a little bit ahead, maybe substantially ahead of where most of us are at a place to actually leverage this technology. In other words, most of us, by which I mean most of you, are still in kind of listening and mapping mode, and so these become, to the extent that you're focused on journey orchestration, it's more around doing kind of quantitative journey listening to supplement some of the qualitative journey listening that you're doing. And even that is a pretty heavy lift, getting all the data that you need in a clean and normalized and useful and consistent and comprehensive way from all the different touch points, and just bringing it in so you can listen effectively. What do our journeys look like today? That in itself is a big lift, and that's why many of you are still, to the extent you're thinking about this at all, are at that phase. And if you're feeling like, wow, that's where we're at, I can tell you, you're pretty much where everyone else is, and maybe even a little bit ahead of the game. But having said that, once again, there are different use cases for journey orchestration engines, and these are pretty exciting use cases, and is why we're still at least kind of conceptually enthusiastic about the future of this technology, at least in the long term, is that particularly when you compare to CDP, which was a little bit more instrumental, these are actually things that ring the bell from a business standpoint. In other words, acquiring customers either digitally or in some multi-channel way, sales enablement to improve your sales efficiency and drive revenue. Revenue optimization intention, this is probably the original use case and still kind of one of the driving use cases of journey orchestration engines. Improved omnichannel service and support, and then channel and partner, channel partnering and channel orchestration is another big one where you're kind of selling or going to market through channels. And so This is a pretty sexy set of use cases. Again, we're not totally there yet, but another way of putting this though is that journey orchestration engines, for the most part, conceptually, in terms of their business objectives, don't necessarily overlap a whole lot with CDPs. The CDPs do tend to overlap with journey orchestration engines. But what's happening in the real world here, the reality is that this is still a new and highly fragmented marketplace that has not seen necessarily a lot of uptick. But let's just take a quick look at this. You have, once again, the MarTech suites who claim to have journey orchestration and technology. Really what those are tend to be based in their outbound marketing platform. So they're kind of email and message orchestration with a few other triggers built in. So again, it's kind of bundled into a pre-existing silo. Then underneath them, you have a whole set of pure play vendors that are likely that want to be channel agnostic. These vendors have a great story. They tend to be on the smaller side and have not seen dramatic uptick in the marketplace. And so that's very interesting as well, which suggests that it has not been as easy as they might wish for organizations to really be successful with them. That's not necessarily a problem with the technology. You'll see in a second, in many cases, the problem is more around us. But you also see some long-standing vendors, Infor, Creatio, previously BPM Online, and Pega. These are sometimes known as marketing BPM or marketing process management platforms. Some of this technology goes back 20 years or so. Really mature sort of BPM-focused platforms. Then you have others like Coinless and Teradata, a little bit more focused on journey analytics, and then some historically contact center platform vendors that are sort of seeing the broader picture and trying to connect what's happening in contact centers with the rest of the customer journey and providing some orchestration capabilities around that. So a lot of this is kind of like where did you come from relative to where you're going. So there's a lot of specialization in this space. So you can, like I said, see some mature offerings in Teradata, and here, you've got some different filters that are going on, and then applying those filters to segments, and then based on those segments, activating some capabilities here, both what channel they want to be contacted with, and then email versus direct mail versus other sorts of things. One of the key steps here, of course, is it implies that you have some segments. So right away, you need to have some kind of a segmentation subsystem to even work a journey orchestration engine. Historically, a lot of the platforms that sort of predated some of these, like Unica, for example, were both a segmenting engine and an orchestration platform. So right away, you need really accurate customer data. You need to know customer status, and then of course you need to have a segmentation strategy and segmentation capabilities built in. So another way of putting that is that advanced customer data management is kind of a precursor to doing journey orchestration properly. The other thing about platforms like this is that they very often then rely heavily on their own interaction modules, particularly their own email modules, when in reality you've got all these other engagement channels. And the trickier part is to activate those different discrete engagement channels from a single kind of control panel. Here's an example. I don't know whether you can see the screenshot very well, but the top is creating a particular journey. The bottom is actually working with by creating segments. So you're creating segments in real time and then applying that. So in a way, this is almost like a journey orchestration engine plus a CDP. We see this a lot in various orchestration campaign management systems. The major email service providers like Adobe Campaign, Salesforce, Acoustic, the former IBM product, and others have their own data subsystems where you're building your own segments. So, this is a legacy of the fact that in many cases we didn't even have a CDP. So many orchestration engines then have their own segment building capabilities, sort of built in. So that's another area of overlap. I think in the future, you'll definitely want to disconnect those two logically, have one place where you're managing data and segments and another, where you're managing decisioning. But the other thing about journey orchestration is I think it's calling into question some maturity issues and some current challenges. One is the breadth of scope, which is realistically how much of the customer journey do you think you can manage centrally, or should you manage centrally? And this then raises a number of issues with respect to technical integration. So data integration is one issue. Event and service integration is even harder. But even if you feel like the vendors are tackling that, another question here is around enterprise governance. Like, who actually owns the customer journey, and who has the right to be able to say that this is what's going to happen in a call center, this is what's going to happen in an email? We think the future is going to be a kind of cooperative governance model between kind of the centralized owner of the customer experience working with the different channel specific managers, like the DX manager managing your website, the CX manager handling your customer success, the MarTech manager managing your email and outbound engagement, so on and so forth. Part of what this is also exposing is there isn't always a lot of skill sets, people who can really manage and master a customer journey across all these different points. So definitely journey listening and analytics is the place to start, but it's also at some level the hardest nut because there's very significant data availability issues. So these are early days for omnichannel journey orchestration. And having said that, though, to the extent that personalization is one of the key decisioning sort of services that you're doing here, we think in the future this is where decisioning will live. But the larger story here is, because of these maturity questions, this is more the longer term future, right? So the promise of journey orchestration, omnichannel journey orchestration, for most of you, in most cases, you'll be able to do some interesting pilots with it, but this dream of this kind of nuclear control panel where you're the master of this is probably some years off. And so this then begs the question, what do I do in the meantime? That's what I'm going to kind of wrap up with here. Just talking about some of your recommendations. A couple of questions have come in. Thanks for those. I invite you again, if you have other questions or concerns. We're going to have time to address those in a couple of minutes here. So feel free to chime in through the GoToWebinar control panel. You'll see the questions tab and you can just ask there. Or if you want to just share an opinion. Okay, let's go back to the reference architecture that we started with. And I think there's a couple of key questions for you when it comes to data versus decisioning. So first is, what's the scope of your CDP platform? On the one hand, you may need it to do some core data management, some data modeling, maybe reporting and visualization, data integration, so on and so forth. Or maybe you're going to inherit those services from a separate data fabric. If you want those in your CDP, and again, many of you will not want that in your CDP, then chances are that the vendor you pick for that is likely not to be particularly strong at rules and decisioning, and vice versa. So you may be taking a different approach to say, I want to get, at least in the near term, might not be the best long-term architecture, but in the near term, I want to couple not the orange and blue here, but I want to couple the orange and purple. In other words, I want a CDP that also gives me some omnichannel engagement and some degree of personalization, including runtime personalization. And that's a legitimate near-term architecture. I'm not sure it's the best long-term architecture, so 2025, maybe you're looking at this differently, but if we're in learning mode, which most of us are, it's a decent near-term architecture. What I'm suggesting here is, if you think you can get all three of these in the same platform, you're probably mistaken. Vendors will tell you otherwise. CDP vendors will say, oh, no, we can do this soup to nuts, and I'm here to tell you that they're wrong. Now, journey orchestration engine, is a couple things are going to be happening here. One is, I think we're going to see the rise, more attention to not necessarily journey orchestration engines, although that technology will increasingly mature, but the rise of omnichannel personalization engines, which is not necessarily to handle all of the decisioning, not all the next best action, but at least in the near term, some segmented and maybe even one-to-one engagement models and capabilities that are outside of a specific channel. In other words, omnichannel personalization as a layer. And so at Real Story Group, we're actually modifying our own research. And then by the end of the year, we're going to call this the personalization and orchestration layer. And we're adding a number of new personalization vendors to our research here. So if you subscribe today, you'll get access to this with your year-long subscription. By the end of the year, we'll have dramatically expanded the scope of this particular model, because although we think that journey orchestration is where personalization will live in the long run, in the near term, personalization as itself and personalization capabilities as a freestanding capability is an interesting stepping stone, and for many of you, a potentially useful near-term stepping stone. The other thing I wanted to point out is that you'll see a lot of journey orchestration within different engagement channel platforms. So, for example, this is an ESP, an email service provider, Oracle Responses, where you can build an engagement palette. It's primarily messaging based because it's a messaging form for email and mobile messages and others. And so many of you are still working in this world. In fact, many of you are still getting started in this world, and that's okay. What's interesting about this is we're sitting here talking about omnichannel orchestration, omnichannel personalization. Most of you are struggling with single channel personalization and single channel orchestration. And so let's just remember that. And, you know, we recently, for example, had a meeting of our MarTech Stack Leader Council. And when they self-reported where they were on personalization, it was not particularly advanced. And these are some of the biggest companies in the world. In fact, I would say that, you know, we get inquiries all the time from our subscribers. And the message very often is, hey, RSG, I feel really behind when it comes to personalization, and for that matter, journey orchestration. And the reality is, like, you know, although 99% of the calls people say we're behind, statistically 99% can't be behind. Everybody thinks they're behind. The reality is that the whole world is still very much getting their feet wet here. So don't feel like you're behind. And it's reasonable for you to still be modernizing within a particular engagement channel. You just want to be thinking forward to this omni-channel future. So that brings me then to the key takeaways. So let's start with CDPs. Don't purchase a CDP until you figure out where it's going to fit in your stack from a services capability. This is really, really important. And note that you may have different short and long-term stories here. Your short-term story might be that you're going to use it as a substitute for a data fabric that may not exist or may not be available to you, but over time, maybe you're going to rely more on enterprise services there. Same story is that in the near term, you may use your CDP for personalization, light orchestration, but in the long term, you're likely to migrate that to someone else. That's reasonable. So you may want to have a short-term and a long-term story, but have a story around where the CDP fits in your stack. Journey orchestration engine technology, and for that matter, enterprise journey operations remain immature but promising. So that means you shouldn't dismiss it out of hand, but it's not going to come in here as some like miracle, you know, the cavalry is coming to improve my customer journey orchestration. We'll have a lot of work to do here first. We think that in the near term, independent personalization platforms are going to fill some of this vacuum. They're going to fill some of the space for omni-channel decisioning that journey orchestration engine vendors don't adequately occupy today. To be sure, they're not focused on the full range of decisioning, but particularly from a marketing standpoint, maybe less from a customer services standpoint, but from a marketing perspective, potentially offer a lot of value to you. In the meantime, it's totally okay to work on your channel-specific personalization game. Everyone else is. And so the goal is, yes, optimize it, but then also think about where can we be going from an omni-channel perspective. But to do that effectively, you must put your customer data house in order. So having reliable, unified, accessible, activatable customer data is really table stakes for this. And then the larger story here is, you know, do your research about these vendors. They say one thing, they do another. This is unique, but is an endemic story in the MarTech space. So, you know, Real Story Group can really help you here in terms of sorting out your options and giving you the truth, sometimes the hard truth about what vendors are good at and what they're not good at. So to that extent, there's 3 ways that you can engage with us. The first is to just license our research, our hard-hitting vendor evaluations to a single stream like customer data platforms or journey orchestration engines. You get access to decisioning tools there like Real Quadrant to build a custom shortlist and a number of visuals, certainly phone support from us, and really help you in more of a self-service way, but with us kind of in the background, make good decisions around the technology you're going to select. The second offering that we have is a full stack subscription where you get access to all of our vendor evaluation research. Typically larger enterprises do this because they're constantly getting questions about these technologies, often have overlapping technologies, and we help you with your stack decision making. Then on top of that, we've got a select group of stack leaders who are joining our exclusive peer council. This is a confidential private council of stack leaders who get together and share lessons and advise on our roadmap. So, you know, we'd be happy to help you out in any of those 3 ways. Of course, would just reiterate that we only work with end user enterprises. We never advise or consult with vendors. That makes us unique in the analyst space. So these services are not open to vendors, but if you're an enterprise, then we would certainly welcome working with you. So Scott can tell you a little bit more how you can do that going forward. We've got a number of questions, and so we'll try to go through those really quickly just as soon as Scott's done here. Scott.
Great, thanks, Tony, and thanks again to everyone for taking some time out of your day to join us. I know we went a little bit over on time, but this is such an important and hot topic, so thanks for sticking with us through this presentation. I do want to mention that you can always download excerpts from our research, whether it's CDP, journey orchestration, or any of the other areas we cover. All of the research pricing that Tony just mentioned is available on our website, and if you'd like, you can actually schedule a behind-the-scenes tour of the Real Story Group customer experience. Just drop a line to explore@realstorygroup.com, and we'll be happy to schedule a 15 to 20-minute overview of those tools that Tony was mentioning. With that, Tony, there are several questions, so hopefully folks can stick around and listen to those.
The first one is from Thomas, and he's asking, where do you see the strategic importance of onboarding companies like Neustar and LiveRamp trending in the bigger CDP picture? Will they play a critical role? And so, I don't know whether it's a critical role, depends on your organization. These can certainly supplement and work with the CDP. What's useful about them is that they tend to have relationships with, the different media venues that you want to activate. And so, for those of you who are more ad focused and you're outputting suppression lists or lookalike lists from your CDP, an intermediary like a LiveRamp can be useful, but I don't think it's necessarily essential for everybody. It's just another, in a sense, it's another destination channel. Thomas is also asking, would you recommend or do you see clients adopt a multi-CDP strategy to get an end-to-end offering from unification to segmentation to activation? This is a really interesting question because in some cases, yes, we have seen vendors literally select two different CDPs, one that's more data management oriented, one that's more activation oriented, and they have reasons for doing that. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that to everyone. I think many of you may already have the data management capabilities in your enterprise, you just haven't directed them towards customer data adequately. In other words, if you already have a collection of data integration tools, data warehouse, data lake capabilities, you could configure those to provide a customer data fabric that would obviate the need for a CDP to play that role. But the short answer is yes, we have seen, and there's a legitimate story around potentially having two CDPs. So Nick is asking, how do you guys envision journey orchestration being influenced by segments and user behavior? Well, I think that both of those things, both segments, data in segments, and then data about user behavior are essential to journey orchestration because you need to know what category does a person fall in order to properly listen and respond to them. And then secondly, if we're talking about orchestration, then you need to know their behavior over time. So whether you want these capabilities from a journey orchestration engine itself is another question. I would argue that this sort of customer data management and tracking is better done at an enterprise level, decoupled from a journey orchestration engine, and it's feeding that data as needed to the journey orchestration engine. So Aurora, good to see you back here. Aurora is asking, what are the downsides if we choose to have our marketing automation platform handle our marketing omnichannel journey orchestration in the near term? So this is, again, the sort of compromise, Aurora, that we've been talking about is in the near term, this might be a valid choice. I think the issue is that you always end up and I'd give you the same answer if you said maybe my WCM is the center of this universe, or maybe my CRM is the center of this universe, which we've seen people do, and then bring all the other events and activity into that. And so the question is this really the center of your universe? And you're going to have to keep integrating events and things with it, like, okay, this happened on the website, this happened. A CDP does make that easier. They're typically going to be better at orchestrating outbound activity and much weaker at orchestrating inbound activity. And so a lot of it in the end is getting you to a message, getting you to a message out to someone. So it tends to be more proactive and a little bit less kind of listen and respond, which you tend to see more with more holistic journey orchestration engines. So it's a different model philosophically, and it's a different emphasis. But having nothing else, it's a reasonable kind of near-term solution. Thomas is asking, how mature do you consider AI learning-based mechanisms to automate optimized omnichannel customer engagement compared to more traditional curated? We always say start with curated and see how it works. Once you get really, really good at this and you start doing it a lot, and you actually have the data and the content to support these other variants, then at some point you likely do want to turn it over to a more automated process. These tend to demo a lot better than they work in real life. It's really demo candy. Very, very few organizations actually have the internal chops to execute on this or have reached the level of maturity, or critically, do not have sufficient data or content to actually provide all the different variations that they want. So, you know, it's intellectually interesting. I think for the most mature customers, where they're just totally overwhelmed by the number of rules that they have to not just create but maintain, then that's a hard problem, and at that point you want AI to step in. But this idea that AI can kind of step in from day one, you know, the vendors will demo that to you and say that it's magic, and the reality is not. James is asking, would you classify Salesforce Journey Builder as the same messaging focused, Joe, like you did with campaign and responses? And the answer is yes. You know, Journey Builder is basically a campaign management system. To Aurora's question, its focus is primarily on outbound engagement and creating the logic around that. Salesforce says that it's more than that, and it's not. That's why Salesforce has first OEM'd and now acquired Journey listening and Journey orchestration capabilities. Most recently with Evergage, was essentially a tacit acknowledgement that Journey Builder is not an omni-channel campaign management or Journey listening platform, but it does do, you know, what it does. So next question, also from James here. Could you help us understand what you mean by event handling by providing an example of it? Is it the same as triggering? Well, triggering would be a subset of event handling. Event handling is basically, you know, something happens either externally or within the platform with respect to, you know, today is somebody's birthday. Today is the midpoint between the monthly newsletter that we send them. Somebody has an abandoned shopping cart. Somebody has been visiting more than 10 web pages this week. So it can be triggered, but also it can be just, you know, by a particular, you know, there may be a trigger that then incents something, but the broader picture here is some set of events that either have happened outside or that you want the CDP itself to activate. James is asking, what are some of the reasons why the pure play Joe vendors like Kitewheel and Thunder are under-delivering versus expectations? You know, again, I think it's partly that the technology is relatively immature and the inherent difficulty of being able to listen and activate across all these channels. And then finally, perhaps the biggest problem is us. We're not really set up as organizations to really leverage these platforms as much as we'd like. Milind, really good to see you here, Milind. Does it make sense to use a CDP as a customer 360, or is there still value in building the customer 360 as part of the data warehouse? That depends a little bit on what you mean by customer 360. I think that if you already have a customer data fabric, that's probably the best place to be doing reporting, because it's going to set up to do that really well. It's going to clean, normalize the data, probably have really advanced reporting tools on top of that. And so your CDP is never going to be as good at reporting or as mature of a reporting environment. It can stand in if you don't have one, but if you already have one that's more mature within your data fabric, that's typically going to work better for you. James is asking, does Journey orchestration tools have the ability to store mass quantities of data, or does it have to be smaller in order to be nimble in their processing? This is a great question. They'll tell you that in theory they have the ability to store it, but the reality is that that's another of many potential performance bottlenecks. We can talk a lot about performance bottlenecks in Journey orchestration. There's different architectures around there, but that is certainly potentially one of them. Thomas is asking, do you see a CDP to be able to take the role of an omnichannel content platform in your stack, or does this go back to building the enterprise WCM system? No, I don't see CDPs playing this role. And those that say that they are taking you on a very dark alley. CDPs should never be managing your content. Now, it can ingest content from an OCP or some other platform, ideally in a structured way, if it's going to be activating it. Ideally, we see OCP as a separate standalone solution, and you can take a look at our analysis and some of our other webinars around this. We think that the future of OCP is probably evolving more out of digital asset management space rather than the WCM space. There's a number of reasons why WCMs are somewhat crippled in their ability to really serve as an omni-channel platform as opposed to just a narrative-centric multi-channel platform. That's a whole other discussion. But basically, you don't use a CDP to manage content. Use a CDP to manage and ideally, activate your data. And it may have content with it along the way that you've managed somewhere else. Okay, that was a lot of questions. Really great questions. Thanks for participating. We went a little bit late, but hopefully still of value to you. I want to remind you we're going to be having some other webinars coming up on selecting DAM technology, what the CDP marketplace looks like in the coming year. But if you have any questions at all about engaging with us, feel free to reach out directly to my colleague, Scott Dill, in addition to being a very smart individual, also a super nice person. So for Scott and the rest of the RSG team, this is Tony Byrne signing off. Bye now.